Welcome, everyone. This is a Broom Closet Briefing podcast, and I'm your host, Broom, and this is our episode number 7. I think so. Um, and today is a No Biggest No Kings protest march. This is being recorded on 28th of March 2026, and today's episode we are going to talk a little bit about this junk cabinet that Tangerine has and how we are going to see the exit arc of each of these members. And last week and this week, I actually posted some articles on some of the exit arc that we can see for some of its members. And we're going to talk a little bit about how similar they are and how the exit arc is not necessarily a fall, but it's kind of like a function. So grab a cup of water, tea, any beverage that helps you kind of sit through this a little bit, and let's get started. So I want to say there is a very specific illusion that modern political storytelling kind of relies on, and it's one that people don't question nearly enough, which is the idea that individuals kind of rise and fall based on their own actions in a very like a that way you can just say it like, oh well, this is where they started to fall, or this is where they rose, and then this is where their fall began. It's not that clean or linear, I want to say. It's as though power structures are these neutral environments where consequences simply land on whoever deserves them the most at that time. So, that framing is convenient because it simplifies everything into personal narratives, into heroes and failures, and into decisions and consequences, but it completely ignores the architecture that sits underneath those outcomes. So when you step back and look at Tulsi Gabbard, Pete Hegseth, Kristi Noem, not as isolated like figures in his cabinet, but as participants within the same system, what begins to emerge is not like three separate trajectories, but you will actually be able to see one repeating pattern that is too consistent, I would say, to dismiss as coincidence. So the similarity is not in their personalities, not even like in the specific controversies that are going to contribute to their so-called fall, but in the way the system has interacted with them over time, shaping their rise, their positioning, and now increasingly, I would say, their vulnerability. So, what makes this pattern particularly uncomfortable to acknowledge is that it challenges the very idea that power is anchored in competence or even stability. So, in a system that is driven by narrative, visibility, and emotional like coherence, the individuals who are elevated are often not the ones who are best equipped to manage complexity behind the scenes. So, but the ones who can actually translate the complexity into something that feels decisive and digestible on the surface. That quality is incredibly valuable when a regime is trying to maintain a certain kind of story about itself, because it allows contradictions to be smoothed over, tensions to be kind of reframed in a way, and uncertainty to be presented as clarity. So, however, I would say the same quality that makes someone effective in that role, like these people, also makes them very, very vulnerable, because their value is tied to how well they serve the narrative, not to how deeply they are embedded in the system's core stability. So once the narrative begins to kind of like fracture, once reality becomes harder to align with their messaging, which is what we are seeing right now, the system does not really collapse inward towards its center. Instead, it actually redistributes the pressure kind of outward. And that redistribution is where these exit arcs would begin. So, in the early stages, I would say nothing appears to be wrong, right? And that is precisely why I would say this phase is so often like overlooked. So the individuals in question are still in their roles, still visible, like still, speaking like nothing happened, still speaking with authority. And from the outside, everything would seem like intact. But what is shifting is not their position, but kind of like the context around it. For example, Tulsi occupies a role where intelligence must be translated into a public facing narrative, right, which places her at the exact point where discrepancies between what is known and what is claimed, and I would say what is communicated, begin to surface. While Pete Hegseth operates within an institutional environment that is far too complex to be governed through performance alone. I don't understand why he got that job in the first place. I mean, kind of we understand it, but these decisions carry consequences that extend beyond the scope of any single narrative framework. Kristi Noem, by contrast, would move towards moments of visibility with a kind of immediacy that ties her identity directly to events before those events have fully stabilized into something coherent. So these are very different roles, but they share a common structural feature, which is that each of them becomes associated with something that is very unstable. So once that association is established, the system does not immediately react by removing them, because removal is not the first step. The first step is reinterpretation. So, this is the moment where visibility begins to change in quality rather than in quantity. So, I know people get impatient, like, why impeachment is not happening, or why are not they being removed? This is why. So, here, the same level of exposure that once reinforced their authority starts to invite a different kind of attention. The past will come again resurface, not like as a neutral timeline, but as material that can be re examined and reframed. Networks and affiliations that once functioned as support structures become points of inquiry. Decisions that were previously absorbed into a broader narrative, they would start to stand on their own, stripped off of their context, and therefore more vulnerable to scrutiny. Importantly, none of this requires the individual to act any differently. The shift is not in the behavior, but in perception. And perception, once it turns, is extraordinarily difficult to reverse because it alters the framework through which every subsequent action is interpreted. So, as this in reinterpretation deepens, the system begins to adjust its relationship with the individual in ways that are subtle but decisive. So, support will not vanish in a dramatic or confrontational manner. I know we all want that, but it doesn't happen that way in the real situation because that would draw attention to the shift itself. Instead, it will become inconsistent, then kind of conditional, and eventually unreliable. The defenses that once appeared automatically begin to require justification, and the alignment that once felt visible becomes harder to detect, as though it is being deliberately softened without ever being fully withdrawn. So, this creates a very specific kind of exposure where the individual would remain within the system but no longer benefits from its full protection. The structure continues to function, the institution also remains intact, but the buffer that once absorbed external pressure on their behalf will begin to erode, leaving them increasingly directly connected to the consequences of the system's actions. At this stage, the narrative begins to narrow in a way that reveals the system's underlying priorities. Complexity would become inconvenient because it redistributes responsibility across multiple actors and layers, which would in turn make it harder to maintain a straightforward story. So in response, the narrative would simplify itself, just like we saw in case of Christie, focusing attention on a single figure who can serve as the focal point of the interpretation. This is not necessarily the person who is most responsible in a comprehensive sense, but the one who is most functionally positioned to carry that responsibility in a way that preserves the stability of the broader structure. The system is not operating according to a moral logic of fairness and accuracy. It is operating according to a functional logic of containment, identifying where pressure can be directed without threatening the center. This is where the arc becomes most mechanical in its progression. Once the individual is positioned as the focal point, the narrative reinforces that positioning through repetition and visibility, gradually solidifying the association between them and the issue at hand. The broader context continues to recede, and the simplified version of events will become the dominant frame through which the situation is understood. By the time this process reaches its visible conclusion, what appears to be an abrupt exit is in fact the final step in a sequence that has already unfolded. Kristi Noem's trajectory illustrates this particularly clearly because her apparent fall was not the result of a single moment, but the culmination of a series of shifts in perception, support, and narrative framing that made her the most efficient point for consequences to land. And if you ask me, I think it was in the works for a while. Because if you remember, her number two also resigned a few weeks before her reassignment. So this is not like a uh, like individual events. They are all kind of connected to this whole narrative arc that I'm talking about. So when we talk about Tulsi and Pete, when Tulsi and Pete are viewed through this same lens, the similarities in their arcs are not speculative, but may, I would say they are very structural. They are moving through the same sequence of elevation, entanglement, reinterpretation, withdrawal, and containment, shaped by the same underlying logic that prioritizes the preservation of the system's central narrative above all else. The differences lie in the timing and also in the context, not in the mechanism itself. Mechanism stays the same. This is why their trajectories will feel so familiar. You can read the articles, they are linked to the episode here below. You will see that their trajectories are very similar when placed side by side because they are not independent stories but variations of the same story, same process unfolding within the same environment. What this ultimately would reveal is not simply the vulnerability of these individual figures, but the condition of the system that produces these patterns. A system that repeatedly generates exit arcs like this is not eliminating risk but kind of managing it, redistributing pressure in ways that allow it to maintain its fake stability at its core, while allowing peripheral elements to kind of absorb the consequences of its unresolved issues. So, this is not a sign of immediate collapse, again. That will never happen. You will never be like one day we wake up and this whole shit show is gone. That's not going to happen. But it is a sign of strain because it indicates that the gap between narrative and reality is widening and widening and widening in a way that requires continuous adjustment to sustain. At some point, it will widen enough that they cannot do anything to, adjust it to make it look like that it is all good. Understanding this arc will shift the focus away from the individuals themselves and towards a structure that shapes their trajectories. I would say it reframes their exits not as isolated failures, but as functioned outcomes within a system that is actively working to preserve itself. So, once that perspective is established, the question is no longer whether a particular individual will remain in their position, because we know that they're not going to, but how the system will continue to redistribute its pressure as conditions evolve. The exits, in this sense, are not exactly the real story. They are the mechanism through which the story that this regime wants to maintain is being maintained, revealing far more about the system than about the people who pass through it. The articles are linked to this podcast episode. Go take a look at it. And this is the end of my episode today. I hope you had a little bit of insight on how we can, what we should be expecting. And this is not a reality TV show that we are going through, unfortunately. So there are not going to be a lot of dramatic moment, but a kind of dramatic moment we saw during Kristi Noem's exit. I would say that the other two would probably look pretty dramatic when it happens, but it's not going to happen like overnight or even in a month or like 2 months. It's going to happen when it follows this trajectory that I mapped out for you, because they're all going to follow the same trajectory. All right. And I hope everybody had a good day of being outside if you did go outside. And we are very close, guys. So take a breather. Don't forget that you are not a doomer, you are a broomer. And I will see you guys in the next podcast episode. Till then, please take very good care of yourself. And you can find me on the Broom Closet Briefing Substack. And if you are listening to this podcast on any other app, please, if you like it, please leave me a rating so that that podcast provider can push my podcast out to people who are not on Substack so they can find me there too. All right. And I will see you guys in the next episode. Please take very good care of yourself. Thank you.